Sarah Mitchell had always been different from the other women in her small Texas town. At 28 years old, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that made some people uncomfortable. She worked as a nurse at the local veterans hospital, spending her days caring for men and women who had served their country. Her life was simple and predictable until one summer evening when everything changed. The town's annual fundraiser was held at the community center every July. Everyone showed up in their best clothes, hoping to raise money for the local schools. Sarah wore a sleeveless navy blue dress that her mother had given her for her birthday. She felt beautiful as she walked into the crowded hall, smiling at familiar faces. The air smelled like barbecue and fresh bread. Children ran between tables while adults chatted and laughed. Sarah found a seat near the back, close to where some of her co-workers from the hospital sat. Maria, another nurse, waved her over excitedly. They had become close friends over the past 2 years, bonding over long shifts and difficult patients. Maria's husband worked at the fire station and he sat beside her, looking tired but happy. Sarah greeted them warmly and settled into her chair. As the evening went on, people ate and danced. The local band played country music that echoed through the hall. Sarah felt relaxed and happy. She rarely attended social events like this, preferring to spend her free time reading or hiking in the nearby hills. But tonight felt special. The community had come together for a good cause, and she was proud to be part of it. When Sarah reached across the table to grab a napkin, her sleeve shifted slightly. The edge of a tattoo peeked out from beneath the fabric on her upper arm. It was just a small glimpse of black ink, but it was enough. Jessica Reynolds, a woman known for her sharp tongue and judging eyes, sat at the next table. She noticed immediately. Jessica leaned over to her friend Caroline and whispered something. Both women turned to look at Sarah. Their eyes narrowed as they studied her arm. Sarah didn't notice at first. She was too busy listening to Maria tell a funny story about her youngest son. But soon more heads turned in her direction. The whispers spread like wildfire through the room. Within minutes, a small group had gathered near Sarah's table. Their faces showed a mix of curiosity and disapproval. Jessica stood at the front, her arms crossed over her chest. She wore a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sarah finally realized something was wrong when the conversations around her grew quieter. Jessica spoke first, her voice loud enough for half the room to hear. She asked Sarah about the tattoo, making it sound like an accusation rather than a question. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She hadn't expected this kind of attention. The tattoo was deeply personal to her, a symbol of something private and meaningful. She had never planned to discuss it in public, especially not at a town fundraiser. Caroline chimed in, saying that tattoos were inappropriate for someone who worked with veterans. She suggested that Sarah should cover it up completely, that it showed poor judgment. Other voices joined in, some agreeing and some just curious. Sarah felt trapped. She wanted to leave, to escape the staring eyes and harsh words, but her legs wouldn't move. She sat frozen in her chair, feeling smaller with each passing second. Maria tried to defend her friend, saying that tattoos were common and that Sarah was a wonderful nurse. But her voice was drowned out by the growing crowd. More people approached, drawn by the commotion. Some laughed, finding the situation amusing. Others shook their heads in disapproval. Sarah felt tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give these people the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The laughter grew louder. Someone made a joke about nurses with tattoos, and several people chuckled. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest. She had served this community for years, had cared for their sick and elderly, had worked double shifts when the hospital was short-staffed. And now they were mocking her over something they didn't understand. Just when Sarah thought she couldn't bear another second, the crowd suddenly went silent. The laughter stopped mid-breath. Every head turned toward the entrance of the community center. Colonel James Peterson stood in the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. He was 82 years old, but still carried himself like the military officer he had once been. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he wore his dress uniform, something he only did on special occasions. The colonel was a legend in their town. He had served in Vietnam and had received numerous medals for his bravery. Everyone respected him. Children were taught to greet him properly, and adults always listened when he spoke. His presence commanded attention without him having to say a word. He walked slowly but deliberately through the crowd, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. People stepped aside to let him pass. Sarah watched him approach, confused about why he was there. She had seen him at the hospital occasionally, visiting other veterans or attending ceremonies, but they had never spoken directly. The colonel stopped at her table and looked down at her with kind, weathered eyes. He asked her in a gentle voice to show him the tattoo. Sarah hesitated, unsure of what to do, but something in his expression told her it would be okay. Sarah slowly pulled back her sleeve, revealing the full tattoo on her upper arm. It was a military insignia, carefully detailed and beautifully done. Below it were numbers that looked like a service identification code. The ink was still relatively fresh, done perhaps within the last year. The design was simple but powerful, the kind of tattoo that held deep meaning rather than just decoration. The colonel leaned forward, studying the tattoo carefully. His expression changed from curiosity to recognition, then to something deeper. His jaw tightened and his eyes became glassy with emotion. The entire room watched in complete silence, waiting to see what would happen next. Even Jessica had stopped talking, her mouth hanging open slightly as she tried to understand what was unfolding before her. Without saying a word, the colonel reached up and pulled back the collar of his uniform. Beneath the crisp white fabric on his own shoulder was a similar tattoo. The design was older, the ink faded with time, but the resemblance was unmistakable. It was the same military insignia, the same style, clearly connected to the one Sarah wore. The crowd gasped collectively, the sound rippling through the community center like a wave. The colonel's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his collar back into place. He looked at Sarah with eyes full of understanding and shared pain. Then he did something that shocked everyone in the room. This man, this decorated war hero who rarely showed emotion in public, pulled Sarah into a gentle embrace. She stood up from her chair, and he held her for a long moment while the entire town watched in stunned silence. When he finally stepped back, the colonel's voice was thick with emotion. He told the crowd that Sarah's tattoo honored her brother, Marcus Mitchell. Marcus had been a Marine who served under the colonel's command years ago in Afghanistan. He was 24 years old when he died, saving 3 of his fellow soldiers from an explosion. The colonel described Marcus as one of the bravest young men he had ever known, someone who never hesitated to put others before himself. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as the colonel spoke. She had rarely talked about Marcus since his death 5 years ago. The pain was still too fresh, too raw. Getting the tattoo had been her way of keeping him close, of honoring his sacrifice. She wore it proudly but privately, not seeking attention or sympathy from others. It was her personal memorial to the brother she had loved and lost. The colonel continued speaking, his voice growing stronger. He explained that he had gotten his own tattoo shortly after returning from that deployment. He had lost 12 men under his command during that tour, and each name was etched into his memory forever. The tattoo was his way of carrying them with him, of never forgetting their sacrifice. He had kept it hidden for years, just like Sarah, because some pain was too personal to share with the world. The community center remained absolutely silent. People who had been laughing moments ago now looked at the floor in shame. Jessica's face had turned pale and she seemed unable to meet anyone's eyes. Caroline had tears running down her cheeks. They had judged Sarah without knowing her story, without understanding the depth of her loss. Their cruel words now hung in the air, impossible to take back. The colonel turned to face the crowd, his military bearing returning. He spoke about sacrifice and honor, about the men and women who gave their lives so others could live in freedom. He reminded everyone that true patriotism wasn't just about flags and speeches. It was about remembering those who served, about honoring their memory in whatever way felt right. If Sarah chose to do that with a tattoo, then she was showing more respect than most people in that room. Maria stood up and moved beside Sarah, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. Her husband joined them, standing tall and proud. Slowly, others began to stand as well. First, it was the other veterans in the room, men and women who understood the weight of service and loss. Then it was their families. Then others who felt ashamed of how Sarah had been treated. Within minutes, nearly everyone in the community center was standing. The colonel asked Sarah to tell them about Marcus. At first, she shook her head, too emotional to speak. But he encouraged her gently, and Maria squeezed her hand for support. Sarah took a deep breath and began to talk. Her voice was quiet at first, barely above a whisper. She described her big brother, the boy who had taught her to ride a bike and helped her with homework. The young man who had always known he wanted to serve his country. who had joined the Marines right after high school. She told them about his letters from overseas, full of hope and humor despite the dangers he faced. She described the last time she saw him, when he came home on leave and they spent a whole day hiking in the hills. He had told her not to worry, that he would be careful, that he would come home safe. But 3 months later, the officers came to their door. Her parents had never been the same after that day. Sarah explained that Marcus had died pushing another soldier out of the path of an explosion. He had seen the danger and reacted instantly without thinking about himself. 3 men went home to their families because of what Marcus did. One of them was now a father of 2. Another had just gotten married. The third had gone back to school and became a teacher. Marcus's sacrifice had rippled outward, touching lives in ways they would never fully know. As Sarah spoke, the colonel nodded, his eyes distant with memory. He remembered that day clearly, the chaos and the horror of it. He remembered holding Marcus as the medics worked frantically, knowing it was too late. He remembered writing the letter to Sarah's parents, struggling to find words adequate to describe their son's bravery. That letter had taken him 3 days to write, and he still didn't think he had gotten it right. The colonel added details that Sarah had never known before. He described how Marcus had been respected by every soldier in the unit, how younger Marines looked up to him for guidance. Marcus had a gift for keeping morale high during the darkest moments. He would tell jokes during long patrols and share care packages from home with anyone who needed a reminder of what they were fighting for. The colonel said that losing Marcus had affected the entire company deeply. Sarah listened with tears streaming down her face. Hearing these stories about her brother from someone who had been there, who had witnessed his character firsthand, meant more to her than anyone could understand. Her parents had received the official reports and the medals, but they had never heard these personal details. The colonel was giving her pieces of Marcus that she thought were lost forever. Jessica finally found her voice and stepped forward. Her face was red with shame and she struggled to speak. She apologized to Sarah, her words tumbling out in a rush. She admitted that she had been wrong to judge, wrong to make assumptions. She had a nephew who served in the Navy, and the thought of someone mocking his memory someday made her feel sick. Caroline stood beside her, also apologizing through tears. They both looked genuinely remorseful, but Sarah noticed that not everyone seemed affected. A few people in the back of the room still wore skeptical expressions. Tom Bradley, a local businessman who had never served in the military, crossed his arms defensively. He muttered something to his wife about people being too sensitive these days. His comment was quiet, but in the silent room, several people heard it. The colonel certainly did. The old officer's eyes hardened as he turned toward Tom. His voice took on the commanding tone of someone used to being obeyed. He asked Tom directly if he had something to say, if he wanted to share his opinion with everyone. Tom's face flushed and he shook his head quickly. But the colonel wasn't done. He walked slowly toward Tom, his cane tapping rhythmically against the floor. Each step seemed to echo in the hushed space. The colonel spoke about the cost of freedom, about the price that military families pay. He pointed out that Sarah hadn't just lost a brother. She had lost a friend, a protector, a piece of her future. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone in her life would be marked by Marcus's absence. And she chose to honor him in a way that was meaningful to her. Who was anyone to judge that choice? He reminded the crowd that Marcus had died protecting strangers, people he had never met. Those 3 soldiers he saved had gone on to live full lives because of his split-second decision. Their children existed because Marcus chose to sacrifice himself. And yet some people thought it was appropriate to mock his sister for carrying his memory on her skin. The colonel's words were harsh but necessary, cutting through years of small-town gossip and judgment. Tom's wife, Linda, began to cry. She grabbed her husband's arm and whispered urgently to him. Tom looked down at his feet, his defensive posture crumbling. He stepped forward away from the safety of the crowd and approached Sarah. His voice was hoarse when he apologized. He admitted that he had never thought about what military families go through, had never considered the lasting impact of loss. His words were simple but sincere. Sarah nodded acceptance of his apology, though her expression remained guarded. She had heard empty words before, promises from people who claimed to support veterans but did nothing to back it up. The colonel seemed to sense her doubt. He announced to the crowd that the town needed to do better, to move beyond simple platitudes and actually support the families of fallen soldiers. Words were easy, but actions were what mattered. Maria spoke up, suggesting that the town establish a memorial scholarship in Marcus's name. The money raised at future fundraisers could help send local students to college, particularly those interested in public service or military careers. The idea was met with immediate approval. People began volunteering ideas and offers of help. The energy in the room shifted from shame to purpose, from judgment to action. The colonel added another suggestion. He proposed that the town dedicate a section of the community park to fallen soldiers from their area. Small plaques could honor each person who had given their life in service. It would be a place for families to visit, for children to learn about sacrifice, for the community to remember. Sarah's eyes lit up at the idea. Having a physical place to honor Marcus, where she could sit and feel close to him, would mean everything. Within an hour, a committee had formed. Volunteers signed up to research other fallen soldiers from the area, to design the memorial, to organize fundraising efforts. The town's mayor, who had been watching everything unfold from the side of the room, pledged the city's full support. He shook the colonel's hand and promised that the memorial would be completed within the year. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden change. She had arrived at the fundraiser expecting a quiet evening, and was now at the center of a community transformation. The colonel sat down beside her, his energy clearly depleted from the emotional evening. He looked at her with gentle eyes and told her that Marcus would be proud, not just of the memorial or the scholarship, but of the woman she had become. Working at the Veterans Hospital, caring for those who served was its own form of service. They talked quietly for a while, sharing memories of Marcus that only they understood. The colonel told her about a time Marcus had convinced the entire unit to sing happy birthday to a fellow soldier in the middle of a mission briefing. Another time, Marcus had traded his own care package to help a homesick private. These small stories painted a picture of who Marcus really was, beyond the hero of official reports. Sarah asked the colonel why he had never reached out to her family before. He explained that he had written several letters over the years but never sent them. He worried about reopening old wounds, about saying the wrong thing. But seeing her tonight, watching her be attacked for honoring her brother, he knew he couldn't stay silent. Sometimes doing the right thing meant being uncomfortable, meant facing painful memories. As the evening continued, people approached Sarah one by one. Some apologized for their earlier reactions. Others thanked her for her service at the hospital. Several veterans came forward to share their own stories of loss and remembrance. An older woman named Dorothy spoke about her son who had died in Vietnam. She wore a gold locket with his picture inside, her way of keeping him close. She understood Sarah's tattoo in a way that others couldn't. A young Marine who was home on leave asked to see Sarah's tattoo more closely. He recognized the unit insignia and told her that Marcus's story was still told to new recruits as an example of Marine Corps values. The sacrifice your brother made hadn't been forgotten by the military, even if civilians didn't know about it. Sarah had never known this. The thought that Marcus's name was still spoken with respect by people who never met him brought fresh tears to her eyes. The band started playing again, softer music this time. The mood in the room had changed completely. Where there had been judgment and mockery, there was now respect and understanding. The colonel stood with difficulty, using his cane for support. He announced that he was tired and needed to head home. But before he left, he had one more thing to say to everyone gathered there. He reminded them that communities are built on how they treat their most vulnerable members. When someone is hurting, the response shouldn't be judgment but compassion. When someone honors a loved one in an unconventional way, the response shouldn't be mockery but curiosity and respect. He challenged everyone in that room to think about their own reactions, their own prejudices, and to do better. Not just tonight, but every day moving forward. The colonel turned to Sarah one final time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn military coin, the kind officers give to soldiers who have earned their respect. He pressed it into her palm and told her to keep it as a reminder that her brother's sacrifice mattered, that her way of honoring him was beautiful, and that she should never let anyone make her feel ashamed of her love. Sarah clutched the coin tightly, unable to speak through her tears. Maria walked the colonel to the door along with several other veterans. They treated him with reverence, helping him down the steps and making sure he got safely to his car. When Maria returned, she found Sarah surrounded by people wanting to hear more about Marcus, wanting to contribute to the memorial fund, wanting to make amends for their earlier behavior. Sarah handled it all with grace, though Maria could see how exhausted her friend was. The fundraiser continued for another hour, but Sarah left early with Maria and her husband. They walked her to her car in the parking lot, the cool night air a relief after the emotional intensity inside. Maria hugged her friend tightly and told her how proud she was of her courage. Sarah laughed weakly and said she hadn't done anything courageous. She had just been honest about her grief. But Maria disagreed. Being vulnerable in front of people who were judging you took real strength. Driving home alone, Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions. She was drained from the confrontation and the memories it had stirred up, but she also felt lighter somehow, as if a weight she had been carrying alone was now shared by others. The Colonel's words echoed in her mind, his validation of her choice to get the tattoo. She had second-guessed that decision so many times, wondering if Marcus would have approved. Now she knew he would have. At home, Sarah sat on her back porch and looked up at the stars. She and Marcus used to do this as kids, making up stories about constellations and planning adventures they would have someday. Those plans would never happen now. Marcus would never meet her future children, never be there when she got married, never grow old beside her. The permanence of his absence sometimes threatened to crush her, but tonight had changed something. The Colonel had given her gift without meaning to. He had shown her that Marcus's impact didn't end with his death. The soldiers he saved, the unit he inspired, the values he demonstrated, all of that lived on. And now, with the memorial and scholarship, even more people would know his name. Her brother wouldn't be forgotten. That thought brought Sarah a peace she hadn't felt in 5 years. The next morning, Sarah woke to find her phone full of messages. Former classmates, co-workers, and people she barely knew had reached out to apologize or offer support. The town's newspaper wanted to interview her about Marcus and the planned memorial. The mayor's office called about serving on the memorial committee. What had started as a humiliating experience had transformed into something meaningful. Sarah spent the morning responding to messages and thinking about what she wanted to say in the interview. She realized that she had been hiding her grief, trying to appear strong and unaffected. Getting the tattoo had been a private act of remembrance, something just for her. But maybe Marcus's story deserved to be told more widely. Maybe other families dealing with similar losses needed to hear that they weren't alone in their pain. When the reporter arrived that afternoon, Sarah showed her the tattoo and explained its significance. She talked about Marcus's personality, his dreams, his decision to serve. She described the day they learned he had died and how it had shattered their family. Her father had become withdrawn, barely speaking. Her mother had thrown herself into volunteer work, trying to fill the emptiness. Sarah had chosen nursing, wanting to help people the way Marcus had. The reporter asked about the night at the fundraiser. Sarah described the initial mockery and how isolated she had felt. Then she talked about the Colonel's intervention, how he had validated her grief and educated the community. She emphasized that she didn't want people to feel guilty, but she hoped they would think twice before judging others. Everyone carries invisible burdens, and kindness should always be the default response. 3 days later, the newspaper published Sarah's story with a beautiful photo of her tattoo, alongside a picture of Marcus in his Marine dress uniform. The article was titled, "A Sister's Love: How One Tattoo Changed a Community." It detailed Marcus's sacrifice, Sarah's journey through grief, and the town's plan to honor fallen soldiers. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured into the newspaper office from across the state. Other military families shared their own stories of loss and remembrance. Veterans wrote about the importance of honoring fallen comrades. Teachers requested copies of the article to use in their classrooms when discussing service and sacrifice. What Sarah had thought was a personal story had become something much larger, touching people she would never meet. The Colonel called her a week after the article was published. His voice was warm but tired. He told her that he had been contacted by several of the soldiers who served with Marcus. They had seen the article online and wanted to connect with Sarah's family. One of them was actually one of the 3 men Marcus had saved. His name was David Chen, and he lived in California now with his wife and 2 young daughters. He wanted to thank Sarah's family personally. Sarah felt her heart racing as she wrote down David's contact information. She had never spoken to any of the soldiers who knew Marcus overseas. Her family had received formal condolence letters from the military, but those felt distant and impersonal. The idea of talking to someone who had been there, who had known Marcus in his final months, was both terrifying and exciting. She called her parents immediately to tell them. Her mother answered the phone with the careful tone she had adopted since Marcus's death. But when Sarah explained about David Chen, something shifted in her voice. For the first time in years, Sarah heard a spark of interest, almost excitement. Her mother asked her to invite David and his family to visit if they ever came to Texas. They needed to meet the man whose life their son had saved. They needed to see that Marcus's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. That night, Sarah emailed David. She introduced herself and thanked him for reaching out. She kept the message brief, not wanting to overwhelm him with questions or emotions, but she made it clear that her family would love to meet him someday. David's response came within hours. He wrote about his memories of Marcus, describing him as the kind of Marine everyone wanted in their unit. Marcus had been funny and fearless, always ready with encouragement when spirits were low. David explained that he thought about Marcus every single day. When he held his daughters, when he celebrated anniversaries with his wife, when he achieved milestones in his career, Marcus was there in his thoughts. The guilt of surviving when Marcus didn't had been overwhelming at first. He had struggled with depression and nightmares for years. But therapy had helped him understand that the best way to honor Marcus was to live fully, to be present for his family, to make his life count for something. Reading David's words, Sarah cried harder than she had since Marcus's funeral. But these weren't tears of pure grief anymore. They were mixed with gratitude and a strange sense of connection. David's daughters existed because of her brother. They would grow up, fall in love, have their own children someday. Marcus's impact would ripple forward through generations in ways they couldn't even imagine. That thought was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. Over the following weeks, Sarah connected with the other two soldiers Marcus had saved. James Miller was a teacher in Georgia, working with at-risk youth. He told Sarah that he thought about Marcus whenever a student struggled, remembering how Marcus never gave up on anyone. Carlos Rodriguez had returned to his family's farm in Colorado and was raising his son to understand the value of service and sacrifice. Each man carried Marcus's memory differently, but they all carried it deeply. The memorial committee met every week to plan the dedication ceremony. Sarah's parents attended each meeting, slowly becoming more engaged with the community they had withdrawn from after Marcus's death. Sarah watched her father smile genuinely for the first time in years when the architect presented the memorial design. It featured a central stone monument with plaques surrounding it, each honoring a local fallen soldier. Marcus's name would be prominently displayed, along with his photo and a brief description of his heroism. The scholarship fund grew quickly, reaching $20,000 within the first month. Local businesses donated generously, and even people from neighboring towns contributed after reading about Marcus. The committee decided to award the first scholarship that fall to a graduating senior who demonstrated leadership and commitment to service. Applications poured in from students across the county, each essay more moving than the last. Jessica Reynolds became one of the memorial's most dedicated volunteers. She worked tirelessly on fundraising events, organizing bake sales and car washes. Sarah suspected that Jessica was trying to make amends for her earlier behavior, and she appreciated the effort, even if it felt a bit excessive. Jessica had even started volunteering at the Veterans Hospital, bringing magazines and playing cards with patients. Maria joked that Sarah's tattoo had transformed the town's biggest gossip into its biggest advocate. The colonel remained involved as an advisor to the committee, though his health was clearly declining. Sarah visited him at his home several times, bringing him updates about the memorial's progress. His house was filled with military memorabilia, photographs of soldiers he had commanded over the years. He showed Sarah pictures of Marcus that she had never seen before, candid shots from overseas that captured her brother's personality perfectly. She asked if she could have copies, and he insisted she take the originals. During one visit, the colonel confided that seeing the community come together had given him peace about something he had carried for decades. He had always wondered if the men he lost in combat had died for a country that would forget them. But watching the town honor Marcus and plan this memorial showed him that sacrifice was still valued, still remembered. It didn't erase his grief or his guilt, but it helped. Sarah understood that feeling completely. As summer turned to fall, preparations for the memorial dedication ceremony intensified. The date was set for Veterans Day, giving them several months to complete construction and organize the event. Sarah's parents threw themselves into the planning, working with the mayor's office on speakers and programs. They invited David Chen and the other 2 soldiers Marcus had saved, along with members of Marcus's old unit. The colonel would give the keynote address. Sarah noticed changes in herself during these months. The raw, angry grief that had defined her for years was transforming into something different. She still missed Marcus terribly, still felt the ache of his absence every day. But now there was also gratitude mixed in. Gratitude for the time they had together, for the impact he made, for the community that was choosing to remember him. She felt less alone in her loss, less isolated by her pain. One evening in late October, Sarah returned home from the hospital to find an unexpected visitor on her porch. An elderly woman she didn't recognize sat in the rocking chair, a worn photo album resting on her lap. The woman introduced herself as Helen Morrison. Her grandson had served with Marcus and had been wounded in the same attack that killed him. Sarah invited her inside, curious and slightly nervous about what she might hear. Helen explained that her grandson, Tyler, had suffered severe injuries that day and spent months recovering in military hospitals. He struggled with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress. He blamed himself for not being able to save Marcus, even though the blast had knocked him unconscious. Tyler had followed the news about the memorial and wanted to attend the dedication, but he was terrified of facing Sarah's family. He worried they might blame him for surviving when Marcus didn't. Sarah felt a wave of compassion for this young man she had never met. She assured Helen that her family held no one responsible except the enemy who planted that bomb. Marcus had made his choice consciously, and it reflected who he was as a person. They would be honored to have Tyler at the ceremony, to thank him for his service and his friendship with Marcus. Helen's eyes filled with tears of relief. She pulled several photos from her album, images of Marcus and Tyler together overseas, laughing and looking impossibly young. These photographs became precious additions to the memorial planning. Sarah scanned them and shared them with the committee, with her parents, with the newspaper. Each image revealed a different side of Marcus, goofing around with his unit, reading letters from home, helping local children in Afghanistan. These weren't the formal military photos that usually accompanied memorial services. These were glimpses of Marcus truly alive, engaged with the world exactly as Sarah remembered him. The response to these personal photographs was powerful. Other military families began sharing their own photos and stories, creating a tapestry of remembrance that extended beyond just the memorial. The community center dedicated a wall to displaying these images, creating an informal gallery of local service members past and present. Children would stop and ask their parents about the people in the photos, learning history through personal connection rather than abstract facts. Sarah's work at the Veterans Hospital took on new meaning during this time. Patients who had heard about the memorial began opening up to her more freely, sharing their own stories of loss and survival. She realized that many of them carried similar tattoos, similar tokens of remembrance for fallen friends. Her willingness to be public about her grief gave them permission to acknowledge their own. The hospital became a place of healing not just for physical wounds but for emotional ones too. One patient in particular, a Vietnam veteran named Robert, had been at the hospital for weeks with pneumonia. He was gruff and difficult, refusing most attempts at conversation. But when he saw Sarah's tattoo while she checked his vitals one day, his expression softened. He told her about his best friend who had died in 1969, a young man from Mississippi with a quick smile and a talent for finding humor in terrible situations. Robert had never talked about him with anyone, not even his wife. But something about Sarah's tattoo made him feel safe to share. They talked for over an hour that day, Sarah sitting beside Robert's bed instead of rushing to her next patient. He described his friend's last moments, the confusion and fear, the impossible choices of combat. He showed her a faded photograph he kept in his wallet, the edges worn soft from decades of handling. Sarah told him about Marcus, about the memorial, about how sharing these stories seemed to lighten the burden just slightly. Robert cried, probably for the first time since 1969, and thanked her for understanding. As Veterans Day approached, the town buzzed with activity. The memorial construction was completed on schedule, a beautiful tribute in the center of the community park. Local students created art projects honoring veterans. The high school band practiced special pieces for the ceremony. Businesses displayed photos of employees who had served. The whole town seemed united in purpose, determined to honor their fallen heroes properly. David Chen and his family arrived 3 days before the ceremony. Sarah's parents hosted them at their house, and the two families bonded immediately. David's daughters were 7 and 5, energetic and curious about everything. They asked endless questions about Marcus, wanting to know what he liked to eat, what games he played, what made him laugh. Sarah's mother came alive answering them, pulling out old photo albums and telling stories she hadn't shared in years. David and Sarah's father spent hours talking in the backyard, two men connected by tragedy and survival. Her father confided that he had been angry for years, angry at the military, at the war, at God for taking his son. But meeting David and seeing his beautiful family helped him understand that Marcus's death had meaning beyond their personal loss. David explained that he named his youngest daughter Grace, because that was what Marcus had given him, the grace to continue living, to build a family, to experience joy again. James Miller and Carlos Rodriguez arrived the next day with their families. The house filled with laughter and tears as everyone shared memories. The three men who owed their lives to Marcus made a pact to stay connected, to support each other, and to keep Marcus's memory alive for their children. They talked about establishing an annual gathering, a way to honor Marcus and remember their fallen brothers together. Sarah's parents were deeply moved by this commitment. Tyler Morrison came to the house the evening before the ceremony. He was thin and nervous, his hands shaking as Sarah's mother opened the door. But instead of the blame he feared, he was met with warm embraces. Sarah's father told him directly that they were grateful he survived, that Marcus would have wanted that. Tyler broke down completely, 5 years of guilt pouring out in sobs. Sarah's mother held him while he cried, this stranger who had been her son's friend, and told him it was time to forgive himself. The night before the dedication, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stood by her bedroom window looking at the stars and thinking about everything that had happened since that summer fundraiser. A single moment of judgment and mockery had transformed into something beautiful and healing. The Colonel's intervention had changed not just her life but the entire community. She touched her tattoo gently, feeling closer to Marcus than she had in years. Veterans Day arrived cold and clear. Hundreds of people gathered in the community park, far more than the committee had anticipated. Veterans wore their uniforms, families held photos of their loved ones, and children waved small American flags. The memorial stood draped in a large cloth, waiting to be unveiled. Sarah stood with her parents near the front, surrounded by David, James, Carlos, Tyler, and their families. Maria squeezed her hand supportively. The Colonel arrived looking frail but determined. He had insisted on attending despite his doctor's concerns. Sarah helped him to his seat of honor near the memorial. He patted her hand and told her this was the most important speech he would ever give. She could see the weight of all his years of service in his eyes, all the men and women he had lost, all the families he had consoled. Today was for all of them. The mayor opened the ceremony with brief remarks about the importance of remembrance. A local children's choir sang patriotic songs, their young voices clear and sweet in the autumn air. Then it was time for the Colonel to speak. He stood slowly, using his cane for support, and approached the microphone. The crowd fell completely silent, every eye fixed on this legendary figure. The Colonel began by talking about the true cost of freedom. He explained that memorials weren't really about the dead, who were beyond earthly concerns. They were for the living, for families who needed a place to grieve, for communities that needed to remember their values, for children who needed to understand sacrifice. He gestured toward the covered memorial and said it represented every family in their town who had lost someone to war, every parent who buried a child too young, every sibling left behind. Then he talked specifically about Marcus Mitchell. He described Marcus's character, his leadership, his final act of heroism. His voice cracked with emotion as he recounted holding Marcus in those last moments, promising to tell his family how brave he had been. The Colonel said he had kept that promise but wished he had done more, wished he had reached out sooner. He looked directly at Sarah and her parents, his eyes shining with tears. The Colonel called Sarah forward to help him unveil the memorial. Together they pulled the cloth away, revealing the beautiful stone monument with Marcus's name prominently displayed among other fallen heroes. The crowd gasped at the craftsmanship and the powerful simplicity of the design. Each name was accompanied by a small photo and the dates of their service. Marcus's bright smile looked out at everyone, forever young, forever brave. David Chen stepped forward unexpectedly and asked to say a few words. His voice was steady but emotional as he explained who he was and why he was there. He told the crowd that he lived every day with the knowledge that someone died so he could continue breathing. That burden was heavy, but it also gave him purpose. He looked at his daughters and said they would grow up knowing Marcus's name, knowing the debt their family owed. He turned to Sarah's parents and thanked them for raising a son who valued other lives above his own. James Miller and Carlos Rodriguez joined David at the microphone, the three men standing together in a show of unity and gratitude. They each shared brief stories about Marcus, painting a picture of him that went beyond the hero of official reports. Carlos talked about how Marcus had helped him write letters home to his girlfriend, now his wife. James described how Marcus had talked him through a panic attack during a particularly dangerous mission. These personal moments made Marcus feel real and present to everyone listening. Tyler Morrison was the last to speak. His voice shook badly at first, but he pushed through. He apologized to the Mitchell family for not being able to save their son. Sarah's father immediately stood and walked to Tyler, placing a hand on his shoulder. In front of the entire community, he told Tyler that there was nothing to forgive, that Marcus had made his own choice, and that Tyler's survival was a gift they were grateful for. The two men embraced while the crowd watched in respectful silence. The mayor then announced the first recipient of the Marcus Mitchell Memorial Scholarship. A young woman named Emma Rodriguez, Carlos's niece, had written an essay about serving others and honoring those who came before. She planned to study nursing and work with veterans, inspired by stories of her uncle's service and the Marine who saved his life. The coincidence felt almost miraculous. Emma accepted the scholarship with tears streaming down her face, promising to make Marcus proud. After the official ceremony ended, people lined up to place flowers at the memorial. The line stretched across the park, hundreds of people waiting patiently to pay their respects. Sarah stood with her parents, greeting neighbors and strangers who wanted to share condolences or stories. Many people apologized for not reaching out sooner, for not knowing how to help after Marcus died. Sarah assured them that they were helping now, that this memorial meant everything. Jessica Reynolds approached with her family looking nervous. She had brought a beautiful wreath and asked permission to place it at the memorial. Sarah's mother nodded gratefully. Jessica's teenage son asked questions about Marcus, genuinely interested in the person behind the name on the stone. Jessica had clearly been teaching her children about respect and remembrance. Sarah appreciated the change, the growth that had come from that difficult night at the fundraiser. As afternoon turned to evening, most of the crowd dispersed. But Sarah and her close circle remained, sitting on the grass near the memorial. David's daughters played nearby, their laughter a bittersweet reminder of life continuing. The colonel sat with Sarah's parents, the three of them sharing quiet conversation and comfortable silence. These were people bound together by loss, but also by love and determination to honor those they had lost. Maria brought food from the reception, and they had an impromptu picnic as the sun began to set. The mood was surprisingly light, full of warm stories and gentle humor. Tyler laughed for the first time anyone could remember, teasing James about something that had happened overseas. It felt good to remember the joy Marcus had brought to people's lives, not just the tragedy of his death. Sarah realized this was what healing looked like, not forgetting the pain but making room for happiness alongside it. The colonel grew tired and needed to leave as darkness fell. Sarah walked him to his car, supporting his arm carefully. He told her that this had been one of the most important days of his long life. Seeing the community honor Marcus properly, watching families connect across loss, knowing that future generations would remember these sacrifices, it gave meaning to all the pain he had carried. He made Sarah promise to visit him soon and to take care of herself. As Sarah watched his car drive away, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for this old soldier, who had changed everything with a simple act of understanding. He had stepped forward when it mattered, had silenced the mockery with truth and compassion. His own vulnerability in showing his tattoo had given her permission to stand proud in her grief. She made a mental note to visit him weekly, to record his stories before they were lost to time. The families gathered one last time at Sarah's parents' house that night. They sat around the dining room table, the same table where Sarah and Marcus had eaten countless meals as children. They talked late into the night, making plans to stay connected, sharing phone numbers and addresses. David suggested they all meet again next year on the anniversary of that day in Afghanistan. Everyone agreed immediately. They would gather to remember those they lost and to celebrate the bonds forged through shared tragedy. Sarah showed them the military coin the colonel had given her that night at the fundraiser. It had become her most treasured possession, something she touched whenever she needed strength. David pulled out a similar coin that Marcus had given him before that final mission. Carlos had one too. These small pieces of metal connected them all to Marcus, tangible reminders of his impact. Sarah's mother asked if she could hold them, running her fingers over the engravings with wonder. In the days following the dedication, life slowly returned to normal. But it was a different normal, transformed by connection and purpose. Sarah continued her work at the Veterans Hospital with renewed dedication. She started a support group for military families dealing with loss, creating space for people to share their pain without judgment. The group grew quickly, filling a need that had gone unaddressed for too long. The colonel's health declined rapidly in the weeks after the ceremony. Sarah visited him several times a week, bringing updates about the memorial and the scholarship fund. He loved hearing about the support group and the connections forming between military families. During their last visit, he told Sarah that she had given him a final gift, proof that his life had mattered, that the men he lost were truly honored. He died peacefully 3 weeks after Veterans Day, surrounded by family and with Sarah holding his hand. The town gave the colonel a military funeral with full honors. Soldiers from across the state attended to pay respects to this legendary officer. Sarah spoke at the service, describing how he had changed her life and the lives of countless others. She announced that the memorial committee was adding a special plaque to honor the colonel, recognizing his decades of service and his role in bringing the community together. It would be placed beside Marcus's, two heroes forever linked. Sarah's tattoo, which had once brought mockery and judgment, became a symbol of remembrance throughout the town. Other people began getting similar tattoos to honor their own lost loved ones. A local artist who specialized in memorial tattoos offered discounted rates for military families. Sarah's simple act of love had started a movement, changing how the community thought about grief and remembrance. A year after that night at the fundraiser, Sarah stood at the memorial with her parents on Marcus's birthday. They placed fresh flowers and stood in quiet reflection. So much had changed in 12 months. The scholarship had helped 3 students pursue their dreams. The support group served 15 families. The memorial had become a gathering place for the community, a spot where people came to think about values larger than themselves. David and his family made the long trip from California to celebrate with them. James drove up from Georgia with his wife. Carlos brought his son from Colorado. Tyler came with his grandmother Helen, both of them healthier and more at peace. These people who had been strangers a year ago now felt like family. They spent the day together, sharing new photos and stories, laughing and crying in equal measure. As the sun set on Marcus's birthday, they all gathered around the memorial. Each person touched his name carved in the stone and said a silent prayer or message. Sarah touched her tattoo, feeling the raised skin beneath her fingers. She thought about that night at the fundraiser, about the cruel laughter and the colonel's intervention. That moment of pain had led to all of this: connection, healing, community, and purpose. She realized that Marcus's death had broken her family, but the journey to honor him had put them back together in a new way. They would never be the same as before, but they were whole again. The empty chair at holiday dinners would always hurt, but it would be surrounded by new friends who understood. The silence where Marcus's laughter should be would always echo, but it would be filled with stories and memories shared with love. Sarah looked at the faces around her, her parents smiling genuinely, the men whose lives Marcus saved thriving with their families, the community members who had learned the cost of judgment and chosen compassion instead. This was Marcus's legacy, not just the sacrifice he made in Afghanistan, but the ripples that continued spreading outward. One act of heroism had touched so many lives in ways they were still discovering. As they walked away from the memorial that evening, Sarah felt Marcus's presence strongly. Not in a supernatural way, but in the connections between people, in the kindness they showed each other, in the commitment to remember and honor sacrifice. He lived on in David's daughters, in Emma's scholarship, in the Colonel's final peace, in the support group meetings, in every person who paused at the memorial to reflect on service and courage. The tattoo on her arm was just ink and skin, but it represented something far deeper: a sister's love, a brother's sacrifice, a community's transformation, and the enduring truth that how we honor our fallen says everything about who we are. Sarah had learned that grief shared becomes lighter, that vulnerability can change hearts, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply remember, loudly and proudly, refusing to let those we love fade into forgotten history. She touched her tattoo one more time as they drove home, grateful for the judgment that had sparked transformation, for the Colonel who had stepped forward when it mattered, and for Marcus, whose brief life continued teaching lessons about courage, sacrifice, and love that would echo through generations. The laughter at her tattoo had been silenced permanently, replaced by respect, understanding, and a community forever changed by choosing to truly see the pain and purpose behind a sister's tribute.